The first half of the 20th century was a turbulent period, marked by revolutions, wars, and great loss of life. One of the least remembered and discussed episodes of this period was the severe shortage and famine that cost the lives of hundreds of thousands or even millions of Ukrainians. Between the years 1932 and 1933, this period, which has been called Holodomor by some, occurred when Ukraine was one of the republics that made up the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. The leader had initiated a process of massive collectivization and state control of agricultural lands, with the aim of using the profits from agriculture to turn Russia and the Soviet Union into a global industrial power. There are debates and speculations to this day about this episode, ranging from those who infer that it could have been caused by Ukraine to others who see it differently. There is no consensus on the Holodomor. Fesliyan, are you happy with this action, Patriarch? They cause those who take control to commit crimes. Many Ukrainians are affected. Does not have in its time, its development, and its consequences in Ukrainian and Soviet history. This is Reynaldo Carrillo Vilches speaking. And for those who have asked how to support the new encyclopedia, I bring you the news that we have created a Patreon with exclusive documentaries on the most controversial topics, with live seminars taught by us, and with several more benefits. Your support is essential to keep this project alive. You can find the link below. And in case you don't have an international card for Patreon, we have several payment options for you. You will also be included in the community. We'll be waiting for you there. And without further ado, let's start today's video. The so-called Holodomor, which in Ukrainian literally means to kill by hunger, is the term that various groups have used to refer to the Great Famine that occurred between 1932 and 1933 in Ukraine, which at that time was not an independent nation, but one of the republics that made up the Soviet Union. The Holodomor, it should be noted, took place within the context of the so-called Soviet famine of 1933, which happened throughout the Soviet Union and deserves a separate video. To understand how the events of this great famine unfolded and the debate about the possible reasons that caused it, we must first go back to the origins of that Red Empire that stretched from Eastern Europe to the far east of Siberia. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics emerged as a result of the so-called Russian Revolution, or Bolshevik Revolution, of 1917, which took place in the heart of that vast Russian Empire ruled by Tsar Nikolai II. The Bolshevik Revolution, with an ideological foundation inspired by Marxism and socialism, was led by a politician with extensive experience in Russian politics and communist activism, named Vladimir Lenin. We have a great video about this remarkable figure on our channel, which we invite you to watch as we cover it in more detail there. The events of the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Civil War, and the establishment of the so-called Soviet regime. The truth is that after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which seized power only in the main urban centers of the Russian Empire, a long and bloody Russian Civil War began between the Red Army, that is, the supporters of Lenin and communist ideas, and the White Army, made up of supporters of the Tsarist monarchical regime and other anti-Bolshevik groups. In parallel to this war, the newly established Bolshevik government began a series of policies, among which were the collectivization of land and means of production. In November 1923, years later, the Red Army achieved a decisive victory, which was a fundamental step in the formation of a new state, which was built on the foundation of the largest empire on the planet at that time, and which was also part of a larger plan that aimed to spread revolutionary and communist ideas throughout the world. After the Revolution and the Civil War, a new and brief period began in which there was an attempt to normalize the social, political, and economic situation after the war, mainly through the so-called New Economic Policy, promoted by Lenin starting in 1921. In contrast to the early years of the revolution, when the means of production were collectivized, Lenin's new economic policy brought a kind of economic opening for Russia, allowing more room for private initiative and even foreign investment in key sectors such as industry, finance, and of course, agriculture. In this last sector, vast plots of land were rapidly privatized so that their owners could hire workers and trade freely. This brought relief to agricultural production in revolutionary Russia. As this new political and economic stability was taking shape, Lenin and the other socialist and Bolshevik leaders of the time finally established, on December 29, 1922, the so-called Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as the culmination of the process begun by the Bolsheviks in 1917. This union or federation, which would expand over time, was originally made up of 4 republics where the communists already controlled the territory de facto. These were the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Transcaucasian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which were now united under a single state, a single ideal, and a single leadership, that of Vladimir Lenin. Now then, how did Ukraine, a nation that, although similar, also had ethnic and cultural differences with those Russians who led and ruled that Soviet giant, come to be part of it? What was Ukraine before the Soviet Union? Since early antiquity, the territory of Ukraine, a country full of vast fertile plains with mountain ranges in the west and south, was inhabited by various peoples, including the Cimmerians, Scythians, and Sarmatians, after several years in which there were very few lasting political institutions. In the 9th century, the so-called Kievan Rus emerged, a powerful medieval Slavic state that is considered the common origin of Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians. The current capital of Ukraine, called Kiev, was also at that time the political and economic center of those Slavic peoples who had gathered around the Kievan Rus. This federation, which unified various peoples of the region, it flourished especially in the 10th and 11th centuries and became one of the largest cities in Europe at that time. However, after the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, Kievan Rus began to fragment into several fiefdoms, leaving Ukrainian territory at the mercy of various successive rulers, including the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries, much of Ukraine came under the control of the so-called Russian Empire, an empire that had formed a couple of centuries earlier and was gaining more and more power, with its capital in Moscow. And with that, Ukraine became an important part of the territory of the Russian Empire. And in addition, it experienced much of the westernization process that the Russian Empire was going through, with monarchs like Catherine the Great, Nicholas I, and Alexander II. However, it will be in the 19th century when Ukraine will experience several of the most important key events in its history as a nation. When the Russian Revolution of 1917 took place, with Ukraine being part of that Russian Tsarist Empire, that land experienced years of extreme political and military instability, just like the rest of the former empire. In that sense, in March 1917, after the abdication of Tsar Nikolai II, the Central Rada, the one from Ukraine, proclaimed the autonomy of Ukraine in response to these events. However, several months later, the October Revolution arrives, that is, the Bolshevik Revolution in Petrograd, which brings to power those led by Lenin. In response to these events, the Ukrainian parliament, with sympathies toward the Russian revolutionaries, declares the creation of the so-called Ukrainian People's Republic, and in January 1918 they proclaimed the complete independence of Ukraine from Russia. But in Ukraine, there were supporters of complete Ukrainian independence from Russia, as well as supporters of Ukraine remaining part of the recently dissolved Russian Tsarist Empire. And there were also supporters of Ukraine joining a possible Bolshevik Soviet state proclaimed in Russia. For this reason, the independence proclaimed by the parliament will only become effective as a result of the uprisings, clashes, and conflicts that will arise. The Ukrainians who supported the Russian Bolsheviks established in December 1917 in the Ukrainian city of Kharkov the so-called Ukrainian Soviet People's Republic. This republic is recognized by the government in Moscow, but not by the other nations. Then, in 1919, this entity would change its name to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which would fight against the Ukrainian independence government and the White Army, alongside the newly formed Red Army in Soviet Russia. After this, following years of clashes and conflicts in the region, such as the aforementioned Russian Civil War, the Red Army would consolidate its control over most of Ukraine. By the end, supported by the Soviet Russians, the Ukrainians who sided with the Bolshevik cause gradually defeated the Ukrainian independence movements until they eventually took control. And the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic joined, as we mentioned earlier, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics on December 29, 1922. In this sense, Ukraine was institutionally established as one of the founding republics of the Soviet Union. Thus, it went from being part of the Romanov Tsarist Empire to being part of the Soviet Empire led by the Bolsheviks. It is important to clarify that the Soviet Union was not made up of a single ethnic and cultural unit, but rather was a vast mosaic of peoples, cultures, and languages. With varying degrees of kinship, they were scattered across the vastness of that territory. This was the case for Ukrainians. Although Ukrainians and Russians racially shared the same Slavic roots, Ukrainian identity was forged through a distinct historical and cultural process. For the Russians, a distinct language was also developing, which, although close to Russian, maintained its own unique characteristics. At the same time, within Ukraine itself, traditions, folklore, and a popular language were developing, gaining strength mainly in rural areas. Meanwhile, the urban elites closer to Moscow tended to become Russified, adopting Russian as the dominant language and culture in those urban centers. But we'll come back to this later. So let's go back to the events of that turbulent 20th century. After the establishment of the Soviet Union in December 1922, its undisputed leader, Vladimir Lenin, would experience a rapid decline in health, which would end with his death on January 21, 1924. Even before Lenin's death, several of his former comrades openly competed for power. Now, after his physical disappearance, this started an internal struggle for leadership within the Soviet Union. Among the main contenders who stood out in that political struggle were Leon Trotsky on one side and Joseph Stalin on the other. Both figures had their own visions about the direction the Soviet Union should take. Trotsky defended a more internationalist vision of permanent revolution, while Stalin advocated for a more domestic, more national revolution, focused within the nation's own borders, which over time could influence the rest of the countries. The truth is that in this complex conflict within Russia, Joseph Stalin is the one who wins and takes control. With the power of the Soviet Union already appointed as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1922, in the following years, Stalin gradually consolidates his position. In this new order of things, Stalin puts an end to the semi-liberal new economic policy that Lenin had implemented in 1921, and instead carries out the so-called First Five-Year Plan. With this plan, Stalin aimed to energize and economically lift the Soviet Union, which after the Civil War and the Revolution, still had several lingering economic issues. The main goal of Stalin's First Five-Year Plan is the rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union, a country where agriculture represented half of its gross domestic product in 1928. But understanding the importance, not only economic but also political, that industry and manufacturing would play in the 20th century, Stalin devised this plan, which also aimed to return to the state the leading role over the economy that it had at the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution. Thus Stalin. At the end of 1929, he began a new process of collectivizing all the productive farms in Russia and the Soviet Union, removing almost all private property and organizing the peasants into new and large collective farms called kolkhozes, putting them, moreover, under the direct control of the state organization. This was done with the goal that by controlling property, the state could use the economic surpluses from that sector to invest them in the industrial sector, and thus boost several of its branches, such as the coal, metallurgical, and manufacturing industries, among others. For Stalin, industry was not going to develop spontaneously in Russia, but rather it required the determined will and direction of the state in order to be able to compete against the other Bolshevik powers. The collectivization of land was not something new for the Soviet Union, since as we saw during the revolutionary period, those means of production and agricultural lands were also collectivized. Now after this, as we mentioned, with Lenin's new economic policy between 1921 and 1929, the private sector in Russia once again gained prominence in agriculture. So much prominence that, according to official data from 1922, before Stalin's collectivization, collective farms, or kolkhozes, only accounted for 1.7% of all farms in the Soviet Union. Thus, under Stalin's First Five-Year Plan, not only was private agricultural property in the Soviet Union eliminated, but they went directly also against the so-called kulaks. The kulaks was the term used to refer to the social class of wealthy peasants and landowners. Therefore, the collectivization of land in this way goes hand in hand with Stalin starting the collectivization of these lands. He points to the kulaks as the enemies of the Soviet people and begins a persecution of them within the framework of a process called dekulakization, thus persecuting many of those who had the most knowledge about how to work these lands. Returning to the process of collectivization in Stalin's theoretical approaches, by having the Soviet state control all food production, it would provide farmers and agricultural workers with the necessary amount for their work and for their subsistence, while the rest of the production, which was called acquisition quotas, had to go directly into the hands of the Soviet state to be distributed at its discretion throughout the territory of the Union. And this policy of land nationalization applied in the Soviet Union would also be implemented in the Socialist Republic of Ukraine, which was part of it. Now, according to scholars, this policy of nationalization was applied more intensely in Ukraine, since it had more fertile land and was home to an important labor force. With about 25 million peasants by 1929 and before collectivization, it produced the significant amount of 19 million, which mostly included wheat, rye, corn, and other grains. Legumes, vegetables, and fruits were also grown, and livestock was raised to obtain animal products. Agriculture was so important in Ukraine that it was known as the breadbasket of Europe, that their farms were expropriated, and several of these Ukrainian peasants even deliberately burned food as a protest against the collectivization process. Even so, against all odds, The Soviet authorities carried out this process of collectivization rapidly throughout the Union. To put into perspective how quickly it is being carried out, there would have been constant debates and tensions while the peasants impurity among the unions. As we said, about 1.7% of all the farms in the country. Just 4 years later, by 1932, the number of collective farms now accounted for 52.7% of all the farms in the country. These collective farms went from covering about 260,000 square kilometers to covering more than 5 million square kilometers. That is to say, in 4 years, more than half of the land and farms in the Soviet Union came to operate under a collective production system directed by the state. And this process of collectivization and nationalization would continue steadily throughout the 1930s, concluding in 1939 when 95% of all farms in the Soviet Empire were already operating under this model. Now then, going back to the early years of this collectivization process, that is between 1928 and 1932, the speed with which this policy was implemented was such that Stalin himself published an article in March 1930 titled "Dizzy with Success," where he made a somewhat critical assessment of this policy, but he doesn't limit it. Instead, he gives it free rein, so that the amount of collective land kept multiplying more and more specifically in the Ukrainian case, collective farms for enrichment already represented 70% of all Ukrainian farms. At the same time, many peasants who had lived in poverty initially celebrated being given collective ownership of these lands. Various problems will gradually start to arise. The first problem is directly related to the so-called kulaks, or large landowners. These large landowners were not simply the owners of the land, but they were also the main experts and guarantors regarding the methods of production on that land, and the ones in charge of their internal organization, so that enough food would be produced at least to meet the basic internal demand. But with this process of dekulakization, which even included execution and confinement in forced labor camps, many of these landowners and their families were taken to isolated regions like Siberia and Kazakhstan. Little by little, they erased not only the people themselves, but also the knowledge of those who had been the administrators of those lands for years, plunging many of these farms into a state of disorganization and inefficiency, which led to a rapid decline in production. Another problem that arises with this policy is that many farmers lose the incentives or monetary compensation they used to receive. Therefore, just like the loss of traditional production hierarchies, the loss of technical knowledge in agricultural production leads to widespread neglect of many of these lands. In addition, the Soviet government not only confiscated the land itself, but also the tools and means with which it was worked. This includes tools such as tractors, draft animals, and other essential items, as a way to ensure that everyone was obligatorily integrated into those collective farms or kolkhozes to carry out their work. All these factors, combined with others related to bureaucracy, the political situation, and even climatic factors, set the stage for the Great Famine that the Soviet giant would experience sooner rather than later. As we mentioned earlier, this phenomenon of scarcity and famine would be experienced in different regions of the Soviet Union during the first half of the 1930s, but with different levels of impact in each of those regions. The region and the Republic of Ukraine were where the highest number of deaths occurred during this period. The main reason for this, according to various scholars, would have been the so-called quotas mentioned earlier. These quotas were the amount of food that the Soviet government kept after providing the peasants with the amount of food considered necessary for their subsistence. These quotas varied depending on the region, and as we said, were decided based on the criteria of the central government. In the case of Ukraine, these procurement quotas became especially cheap. That is, the amount of food left for the Ukrainians themselves was unusually low in contrast to other regions. Some scholars have even speculated that this was not only due to economic reasons, since Ukraine produced the most food, but also for political and even ethnic reasons, while other scholars have questioned this theory and speculation based on different reasons. But the truth is that Ukrainians represented an ethnic, cultural, and national group, different from the rest of the republics and groups of the Soviet Union, as we have already explained. But in addition, it was the group that had put up the most resistance to Stalin's collectivization policy. By 1926, Ukrainians made up 21% of the entire population of the Soviet Union, with about 31 million people. At the same time, it was the republic where there was the most opposition and desire for independence from Soviet Russia. So at the beginning of the 1930s, Ukrainians began to witness how there was less and less food available for them to consume. The hypotheses, still inconclusive to this day, as we said, range from a major problem of government inefficiency and centralized planning that accidentally led to this fatal outcome, as part of the collectivization policy, to the hypotheses of an orchestrated plan by Stalin against the Ukrainians and their rebellion against the Soviet government. Whatever the explanation, the truth is that these events took place under the authority and administration of Stalin. So, going back to them, it was in 1931 when the first reports of a possible threat from Ukraine began to emerge. Upon seeing the harvest results in 1931, Ukrainian farmers would have alerted the government about a 21% reduction compared to the previous year, from 23 million tons production dropped to 18 million tons, of which at least about 7 million were to be sent to the government in Moscow. Since the procurement quotas for almost 40%, so the first reports began to emerge about the first victims suffering from this shortage. And this does not go unnoticed by the local Soviet authorities in Ukraine. These Ukrainian authorities, by 1932, the following year, they received complaints from 50 district committees of the Communist Party in Ukraine regarding the acquisition quotas that were being demanded of them. From Moscow, Ukrainian Soviet authorities raised this concern to Stalin, and Stalin responds by sending, in October of that year, 1932, two commissioners he trusts deeply, Vyacheslav Molotov and Lazar Kaganovich, not with the aim of negotiating with the Ukrainian farmers, but in order to implement with the greatest possible force the strict fulfillment of the acquisition quotas that had been set by, as well as, I quote, crush all the counter-revolutionaries. Thus, Molotov and Kaganovich make use of the regime's political police, known by its Russian initials, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the predecessor of the KGB, to pressure or repress the farmers who protested against the acquisition quotas, and to begin what some scholars of the subject have called the Reign of Terror, with the persecution and execution of several centers, hundreds of farmers, ordinary citizens, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. All of this took place, as we said, not only in the context of the agricultural economic situation, but also due to strong opposition that existed in Ukraine against the Soviet regime. At the same time, Molotov and Kaganovich promoted the use of so-called blacklists, which isolated entire villages. They blocked supplies and blocked the movement of food and provisions, unless they were destined for places designated by the Russian Soviet regime. In this regard, in 1932, Ukraine ended the year with the following data. Food production had dropped from 18 million tons in 1931 to 14.5 million tons in 1932, a reduction of more than 20%. In turn, another revealing figure from 1932 is that between May, June, and July, the alarming number of up to 27 deaths per 1,000 inhabitants was reached, which, according to various historians, is closely related to the severe food shortage experienced that year. As the situation keeps getting worse, another measure taken by the Soviet government in Moscow is to close all of Ukraine's borders with the other Soviet republics in order to prevent a large wave of migration. I think it's at... Let's see if this is televisions, because in the information from numerical magazines, Senate was necrop. And for June, 2 months later, the figures, according to official information from the Ukrainian state, were about 196 deaths per 1,000 inhabitants. And this mortality situation was even worse within the Kiev region, the capital of Ukraine, where in May 1933, there were about 208 deaths per 1,000 inhabitants, while in June, there were 316 deaths per 1,000 inhabitants. This is according to current state data, a figure that was not seen in the rest of the Soviet Union. That is why scholars have classified the year 1933 as the most devastating of the entire Holodomor, not only because of the famine itself, but also because of its related effects. For example, during 1933, in Ukraine, there were more and more cases of typhus, which was a large group of bacterial diseases transmitted by lice and fleas. Normally, in situations of famine, overcrowding, and unsanitary conditions, the number of typhus patients multiplies by 10 within a matter of months during the year 33 as well. The decrease in food, especially grains, not only harms humans but also the animals that fed on them. Since much of the food production in Ukraine was also used to feed horses, cows, sheep, pigs, and many others, the number of these animals also dropped drastically from 1928 to 1933. The number of horses decreased from 5.4 million to 2.6 million. The number of cattle dropped from 8.6 to 4.4 million, and pigs decreased from 7 to 2 million. To alleviate this situation, it is recorded that Stalin sent about 176,000 tons of grain to Ukraine during the spring and summer of 1933. However, the demand was much higher than that amount due to the drop in food production at that time. The Ukrainians, without help from the Soviet government, tried to cope with the situation in different ways, such as creating some public dining halls and improvised aid centers. However, this would not have been the reality in other regions of Ukrainian territory, where the struggle for food led to conflicts and violent clashes between farmers and city dwellers. According to direct testimonies, many of the latter were known for violently repelling farmers and peasants who approached the cities to ask for food. The situation became so dire that in some localities of Ukraine, there were reportedly several cases of cannibalism. For its part, the Soviet Moscow government strongly denied that such a situation was taking place in the Soviet Union, maintaining strict media silence about it. One of the most famous cases of this media situation is that of the journalist Walter, while he was a correspondent for the New York Times in Moscow. He had no way, since it was forbidden to travel to Kiev in Ukraine. During that time, he published several columns in which, relying on government information, he denied the alleged famine and spoke of partial failures in the harvests. However, on the other hand, other journalists like the British Gareth Jones, who investigated the situation more closely, by evading the restrictions and managing to get to Kiev, he issued a report that echoed the Ukrainian reality. One of the most forceful lines in this report reads as follows: "I walked through villages and 12 farms. Everywhere there was the cry, 'There is no bread. We are dying.'" However, that famine, which reaches its peak between April and July of 1933, begins to become less severe in the second half of that year. After having implemented a series of mass collectivization measures that were a key factor in this situation, Stalin now begins once again to ease several of these measures. First of all, Stalin orders Molotov and Kaganovich to stop the persecution against counter-revolutionaries and those in charge of the land. At the same time, he authorizes the sending of food to Ukraine and reduces the acquisition quotas. These had been another key factor in this situation, allowing Ukrainians to keep a greater surplus of food. At the same time, he relaxes the land collectivization measures and instead allows the resurgence of some private farms. These measures contribute to the rapid improvement of the situation regarding food production, which had ended at 14.5 million tons. He orders Molotov to allow Ukrainians to keep surplus food. Collectivization of the land. The resurgence of the lands to the collectivization of the land and the resurgence to the collectivization of the land and the resurgence of the land, agriculture to invest them in the industrial sector. These objectives of the first five-year plan were indeed achieved between 1928 and 1933. The collectivization and resurgence of the land. The collectivization of the land. The resurgence. That of cast iron almost doubled, increasing from 3.3 million tons in 1928 to 6.2 million tons in 1932. Steel production also increased significantly, rising from 4 to 6 million tons in the same period. Electricity generation also saw a notable increase, rising from 5 billion kilowatt hours to 13.5 billion in the same period. That is, the availability of electricity across the country almost tripled. And regarding energy resources, coal production went from 35 to 64 million tons, and oil extraction grew from 11 to 21 million tons. In that period, from 1928 to 1933. Likewise, there were significant advances in the production of machinery and capital goods, reflected in an almost tenfold increase in the number of machines and tools produced in the Soviet Union, and a noticeable growth in automobile manufacturing, which went from 800 units per year to 24,000 units during that 5-year period. Heavy industry, in turn, received about 86% of all industrial investments from that first 5-year plan, which confirmed the Soviet Union's priority project of transforming itself into a powerful industrial economy. Through a determined push in strategic industrial sectors, as we mentioned, between 1928 and 1937, industrial production tripled. And by 1941, just a few years after the completion of the second 5-year plan, around 9,000 new industrial plants had been built, and the Soviet Union had established itself as the world's second industrial power, ranking only behind the United States. According to historians, this process of industrialization was made possible thanks to strict state planning and the control of economic resources to direct them to that sector. But, of course, with a high social cost from that agricultural collectivization, which was reflected in episodes that have been called the Holodomor. A human cost that at the same time provided the surpluses to finance that profound and accelerated transformation of the Soviet economy. Although today debates and doubts persist and will continue about the possible exaggeration of these events, as well as whether they were accidental or deliberate, there is consensus that during that year, Ukraine experienced a severe shortage. In this sense, the episode called Holodomor, with its detractors, scholars, defenders, or deniers, stands as one of the most controversial periods, not only in Soviet history, but also in world history, an event that has been little investigated despite its magnitude, turbulence, and the great controversy surrounding it. This episode, and the way it has been addressed, especially in the recent past, has left a mark on the collective imagination of Ukrainians, as it continues to be a subject of interest among many Russians eager to know the truth about their past. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I remind you that your support means a lot to us by leaving your comments, giving it a like, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with all your friends, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. This was Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking to you, and this is the New Encyclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support. Greetings and many blessings to you all.